So, my next post is still working with Diane Kuhl, and it's rethinking nature. Once again, I'm just going to extract certain quotes and speak to those and add more poetry as we go along. This picks up on beyond mechanism and mysticism, and it talks to the working notes of the visible and invisible, and it talks about the critical reflections on philosophical and scientific accounts of nature and how they invoke the primordial pre-human being realm of wild being. Far from displacing metaphysics, Merleau-Ponty shows scientific categories of space, time, matter, causality, and agency are legacies of teleological affirmation. So that's like something with a means to an end of the substance qua God as unity, and they need to be rethought in their entirety. The tension. There's a tension involved that comes about by invoking the distinction between natura naturans and natura naturata. The first term, natura naturans, literally is translated into nature naturing, and that is producing itself, while the second being translated into nature natured, and that is created forms. And I think that speaks to thinking of determinism and existentialism, like, is it nature that is creating us? So is it nature that is naturing us, so that we're a product of our environment? Or is it nature that is natured? Is it created forms? And so is it that we impose order on the environment that's chaotic to elicit meaning and creating, constructing the world in which we live? So much depends on the relationship, in particular, whether the producing and the produced are aspects of a single process that is eminently generative, and that's affective with an A, of its own forms of assemblage, as in Spinoza's Conatus, Nietzsche's will to power, Bergson's Elan Vital, or Deleuze's difference. Or whether these are distinct terms whose linkage is more or less contingent. What is at issue then, she goes on to say, is whether nature is internally productive of itself, such that there is an immanent and irreducible relationship between creating and created that renders matter a lively process of self-formation, or whether matter is an inert stuff that is worked upon by some immanent force or agency external to it, such as God or the subject. And once again, I found the idea of God is problematic. So when we don't understand something, we mythify it and say that's where God is. Descartes interpreted God's role as one that paved the way for his sense of nature as infinitely extended matter. This also focused modern scientists with vestiges of religion. Descartes was nevertheless original. Was nevertheless original, where there was the concern of doubling or differentiating nature as naturans and as naturata, which it had the effect of separating the interiority and the exteriority. Then you think of the cogito, I think, therefore I am. So that made a difference for him, and that was one of his main arguments that he's very well known for. So this becomes the reproduction of universal laws, but is a poor substitute for nature's contingent exuberance. So what's the risk is teleological, in reviving the teleological and the theological, is a sense of internal productivity that render such approaches vulnerable to mysticism. And one of the questions that raised for me is, why does teleological necessarily equal mysticism? Because there's Mills, whose utilitarianism comes into whether something is teleological, so something is good in the fact that it is used for a certain means to an end. So a camera is good for taking pictures, for example, So, teleologically speaking, or utilitarianist in a utilitarianistic way speaking, it is good for that, but it wouldn't be good for baking bread, for example. So in that case, it wouldn't be a good thing, and that's a very simplistic way of looking at it. But that would be the idea of utilitarianism when it comes to teleological. Yeah, so something that has a means to an end. Subject, continuing with quotes, subject-object identity and the romantic or teleological view of non-alienated nature as origin and telos portend a violent political legacy, as Merleau-Ponty had shown in his critique of Marxism and the more or less contemporaneous adventures of dialect. He quotes Husserl, Husserl, saying, "The role of phenomenology is not to break the bond that unites us with the world, as to reveal it to us and explicate it," and who referred to the life world, Lebenswelt, as the new or third dimension of previously unknown phenomena that unfolds between and beneath the opposition presupposed by common sense, philosophy, and science. So this kind of throws into the mix that life world actually is a third component to our existence that kind of bridges this gap, so that we're not living in a binary existence of internal-external, but that their phenomenology, so the experience of phenomena, actually allows us to bridge our internal world of the abstract with the external world of the real, or the real as we're perceiving it, through phenomenology. The life world, continuing quotes, the life world would have commended itself both as a resolution to the separation of natura naturans and natura naturata, and as an account of productivity of the naturans as inherent in corporeal existential processes that are irreducible to mechanism, subjectivity, or mysticism. It is from this perspective that modernity's untenable triad of naturalism, humanism, and theology is to be overcome. So he's suggesting that, the mysticism of theology, the optimism in the extreme of humanism and naturalism seems to be things that can be overcome. There's phenomenological return to life world is the next topic. Existence for him is existence for Merleau-Ponty, being him, in an internally productive formative process wherein means and matter are irreducibly interwoven, the very process whereby hereto meaningless takes on meaning. Phenomenological task is to show how consciousness emerges from, yet remains enmeshed in, the material world. So what they're doing is they're trying to bring together all the determinism and existentialistic ideas and saying there is, in phenomenology, a way for those two to come together. So one doesn't cancel out the other, but that they actually coexist within the life world, within the actual lived experience. He never forgets that, quote, he never forgets that our idea, and that's being Ponty, who is quoted, when he quotes, or when he criticizes Schelling and Bergson, he never forgets that our idea of nature is impregnated with artifice. Our apprehending nature, matter, entails a raft of bodily accomplishments, linguistic practices, cultural assumptions that are integral to nature's unfurling and to our own place within it. Reversal lines of force and folds and ripples across the phenomenal field to render its material multidimension contingent and overdetermined. And so this raised a question for me, is how does the return to the life world anew, if it's already scarred by words, because we are word beings? It's how we engage, it's how we communicate with each other, it's how we consider things. Like if I say this is a pen, that's a signified by a signifier, and it's a signifier we all understand. In Spanish as pluma, and so on. So how do you overcome a world and engage it in a way that's new when you're limited by language. We continue with quotes. For the phenomenologist, there is a critical obligation to interrogate every presupposition, including the one that assumes a pristine material reality awaiting discovery beneath our constructions. And I thought that was a very provocative way to consider things, because if we approach things and we have these ideas already embedded with us, the baggage that we bring with us, then we're assuming that there's something pristine, material, and reality-based to discover, but beneath our constructions of the world. And I thought that was good because it opens us up to see all the different paradigms, and that seems to be the thrust of where this newer theory is going, to not be completely in the existentialist or deterministic or abstractionist world and so on, and Nietzschean and Marxist, but to have shifting lenses to where you're engaging all these worlds that lie beneath the world that we've constructed. So then it's opening up that lying in the non-moral sense and be truth in the moral sense, I suppose, would be a way of seeing it. So it's putting civility aside and actually investigating what would be termed as the real. Realizing that it is limited. For me, I would say it's limited, but because there are some things, unless we have that experience, we're never going to be able to engage in something on that level. Nietzsche suggests that we'll never be able to see the world as a bee. A bee sees the world through its experience, through its usefulness, so we can never actually access the world in any other way than being human. So we're locked into the human condition. So life world is suggested as a universal being. Continuous quotes. All the particular analysis concerning nature, life, the human body, language will make us progressively enter into this life world and the wild being. Brute or wild being meaning is equal to the perceived world. And as I said before, it's very subjective, as no matter how largely we try to enter into it, because we can only access it from the world as experience as human. Kuhl goes on to talk about Merleau-Ponty. He references an essential consciousness, subjectivity, or mind, are but reifications of contingent, desperate capacities for structure and stylize the world that emerge hazardously through within corporeal practices. It is therefore corporeality that is privileged as naturans in this account. So it's our body that actually engages the world, and so that's privileged because we can only engage the world through our physical being. And as much as it is here that productive difference and agenic capacity emerge through being in the world. They go on to suggest that there's a certain rhythm to existence. The antithesis between matter and ideality, or between materialism and idealism, is thus overcome at both the corporal level and the philosophical level. So the body knows the world laterally by style, is what they're suggesting. So to expand on that, it is not a mass of matter, it is rather a standard of things. And I reverted back to this is also subjective because it's the human standard. Nietzsche says we cannot know anything any other truth but the human truth. We're limited to that. It's a measurement of things, an ideality that is not alien to the flesh, which grants its axis, its depth, and its dimension. The body is according a frontier with extraordinary spatial relations that do not cross over. Corporeal space is lived spatiality, oriented to a situation wherein the lived, living, lively body embarks on the architectural dance that actively spatializes and temporalizes through its movements, activities, and gestures. The body introduces patterns, intervals, durations, and effects and affects into Cartesian and Euclidean space from within it, and it continuously reconfigures its own corporeal schema, the aging process of aging, growing, maturing, engaging with the world, and responding to and recomposing its milieu. This is the environment in which behavior is practiced, oriented through experiencing stimuli as meaningful signs. So what that means is that our body receives this stimulus through experience, and it translates that into meaningful signs. And a lot of that has to, they talk about going back into a deterministic Freudian experience, to where with the quote, the positive surplus of signification on the surfaces of objects, and life is understood as the opening of a field of action. And that's how, when we engage the world through our body, that we actually come to understand it and communicate with it and create our inner being through experience of the outer being. The next part they go on to talk about is painting inhuman nature. So we live in the midst of man-made objects, among tools, in houses, streets, cities, and most of the time we see them only through the human actions which put them to use. So in that way, the question has been raised in a lot of the theory as, do objects have affect? And what Kuhl's philosophers that she's working with are suggesting is that objects take on meaning through a utilitarian use. So it's very much a Mill's way of thinking. So we see them through human actions because we are human, and that's how we engage the world, and based on that, how we use them imparts meaning to them. When we become used to thinking of all of this exists necessarily and unshakably. So because this is the world in which we live in, it gives us the sense of something stable. And Marx talks about that, to where we live in a capitalist society here in the Western world, and so we believe that this is the way of things, and there's a sense of stability in it. But the truth of the matter is, there's a whole world of existence that we don't engage with, that is constantly there, that threatens the structure that we have created, because it is a construct. Continuing with the quote, Cézanne's paintings suspend these habits of thought and reveals the basis of inhumane nature upon which man has installed himself. So we have built a world upon this shifting, primordial, constantly folding and unfolding, thriving existence that we are unaware of because of the world we've constructed for ourselves. And Cézanne, Merleau-Ponty, so Kuhl quotes Ponty, who's quoting Cézanne, who says, "The landscape thinks itself in me, and I am its consciousness." It draws attention to the way the artist's body poses a question to the world, whose vectors seem in response to emanate, is continuing Cézanne's quote, emanate from the things themselves, like the pattern of the constellations. So I thought this would be a good place to put in another poem after the next two quotes. There's no break at all in this circuit, the circuit in which we have constructed, because there's that mirror affect where what we believe, what we have constructed, and what has been constructed to us and we've accepted is mirrored by those around us. So that mimetic effect, which we're getting into in the next piece, actually reconfirms what we believe to be true, at least in the Western world. So we have a certain ideology, we're all sharing a certain culture, or we have a culture that we've built together out of various different cultures. So for civility, in the Nietzschean sense, we are ignoring a lot that's going on. So there's no break in that circuit as long as none of those external existences come impose themselves in our space. It is impossible, quote, "It is impossible to say that nature ends here and that man or expression starts here. It is therefore mute being that itself comes to show forth its own meaning." So then when we take away language and we are completely internalized and we're not communicating, because mute to me would mean no communication, not just necessarily the verbal, that's whenever the self can show its own meaning. So it will show forth, but it would be inner reflective, so you wouldn't be able to ever really share that. Quote, "This is not an active mastery, but of self-disclosing of matter that is pregnant in its form, and that poses itself by its own means. To depict matter, and this is a Merleau-Ponty comment, to depict matter as it takes form, the birth of order through spontaneous organization. And to me, that was a religious conceit, because spontaneous organization, there's chaos and things happen by chance, but a lot of times simultaneously with the thing we recognize happening as chance, there are other things simultaneously happening in that same ethos. So I thought that was a religious conceit, and it also was a privileging of, once again, the human experience, which is kind of inescapable. So I thought mirrors, though mirrors really goes with the next piece, really kind of picked up on some of these topics that have been brought up and questions that have been raised. So here's my poem, Mirrors. The blind, dull gaze of the working, feigning contact and interest while mulling about mindless tasks, no doubt dreaming of what they want to be when they grow up. Vacuous laughs steal from behind steel cages that affect a service area, the cold resistance of both landscape and inhabitant, the possibility of touch. I passively look on to the active confrontation that rejects contact with the eyes, those soul-stained windows. I laugh at an insult, safe, less content conversation, the exhaustion slowly seeping into the air surrounding them. Toxic poisoning even Umberto could not wash away. The non-gentle roll of the sea cradling the tension, and I wonder, fully thought, have I just written about me? I wrote this poem while studying in this course and confronting all of the different theory. And like I said, I go out into the world when I get theory in my head, and I look for signs of it. You know, is it valid? Can it be justified? And as I was sitting on the ferry going back to St. John's, the Digby St. John ferry, I witnessed the engagement of people who were in the service industry and people who were passengers, and how the metal service area actually almost functioned like cages, to where the people who were going through the cafeteria were funneled through this labyrinth, if you will, to get their food and pay. And the people who were on the other side of the service industry would engage only as was necessary to actually give service, so that there was a lot of inner reflectiveness, and there was a pull away from the actual touch, so that landscape itself actually came into play. And I thought that was very poignant when we're talking about how man-made objects be among tools, that we live among man-made objects, tools, houses, streets, cities, ferries, and how we can only see these things through human action as we put them to use. And I thought there was that first use, which was to get food and to serve food, but there was that secondary use where there was a sense of safety and division between the two, and how both parties actually pulled towards that separation as opposed to connection. And I thought that was really, really interesting to witness and thinking about that. So, and it kind of called into question for me the break within the circuit, because it seemed to me that there was. I think the intention was, because they had the metal cages and then they had the sneeze guards for the food, but there was enough space left that it was the intention that it would be an open, inviting, welcoming space. But how it was used was very different. So that the birth of order through spontaneous organization actually seemed to take on a very intended use and organization of the space. So I'm going to stop here with that poem, and I'm going to post this, and I'll go on to the next one.